Have you ever had a gun held to your head? I have. At 20 years old, I was caught up in a bank robbery. My heart was racing in parallel with time standing still. I'm scared about my future. I'm thinking about my family. My head was overloaded with 1,000 thoughts. You see, until the trigger is pulled, there are two perspectives. One is an empty threat, and the other is an imminent death. And as I handed the cash over, I thought, I'm going to die. I was terrified. Can you picture this situation in your head right now? Afterwards, I received some great advice that I've often turned to in my life since that day. I was told that I was lucky, that I could choose for this one moment to define a young man's traumatized future, or that this could simply become an interesting, even exciting story to share one day. It crystallized for me how what happens in the moment is simply another experience, good or bad, and we get to choose our own future. Fast forward 20 years, and the UK is in the midst of a global pandemic. Schools are closing, workers are being sent home, businesses are folding, and people are dying. Life, as we knew it, is shutting down. In the middle of this, I found myself staring at a message on my phone saying that my employer had gone into administration and that I no longer had a job. My income, my security, gone. It felt like another gun to my head. Stuck somewhere between a calm and a panic, my head was overloaded with 1,000 thoughts. I'm scared about my future. I'm thinking about my family. Have you ever been in this situation? Perhaps you're in this situation right now. What would you do? Just 5 days later, I founded a startup for the first time. Over the next 12 months, we built a team remotely across the world. We developed some groundbreaking technology, signed commercial partnerships with some of the biggest brands and retailers on the planet, and went through not one, but 2 rounds of investment backed by some of the most credible names in our industry. It was a redemption from a difficult personal challenge and a British startup success coming out of the global trauma of COVID. Sounds good, right? It's all true, but how wonderful if it was as easy to accomplish as that sounded just saying it. And this is the irony of being asked to speak about successfully founding a startup during lockdown, because success is judged through different perspectives. And what I've described is just the tip of the iceberg, but more is still on the cutting room floor. So I'd like to share my personal perspective of what it feels like on the inside of a startup as a first-time founder at 40. So if circumstances created the why now, then the decade that I spent in online shopping defined why this. Hurtling into an economic crisis in the midst of a pandemic, many retailers were struggling, but online sales were booming. One look at the e-commerce share prices or the branding on the boxes that turn up at your home every week starts to paint a picture of the winners in exceptional times. I've been very lucky. I'm working in e-commerce at Amazon and Tesco for years, but this now sits uneasy as I've become increasingly disillusioned by the vice-like grip that the big tech names hold over independent retailers and shoppers. If you don't believe me, think about the last thing you bought on Amazon. If you can't remember the name of the seller, that's a problem and that needs to be solved. I believe that the bands of rebels that are taking the risks in startups are one of the best ways to make the world a better place. The underdog inspires me, and after falling in love with working in a startup for a few years, it pushed me even harder to learn from its sudden demise. It was here that I met my co-founder, and between us we carried over 30 years of industry experience. I don't underestimate the confidence I got from knowing that I wasn't embarking on this journey alone. What do you picture when you think of a successful tech startup founder? Perhaps I can have a guess what you're thinking. Young, white, male, beard, tattoos, some bangles, jacket and jeans. But there's another perspective, and I quickly came to realize that no one fits the mold of a founder. When a friendly investor shared some horror stories from female and ethnic background founders, I empathized with how some investors had dismissed me at 40 as old, an old first-time founder. She just smiled and said, "Welcome to the minority." I was surprised that it seemed there was often some sort of prejudice for founders to overcome, no matter the circumstances, and especially how age wasn't always seen as a benefit. I discovered lots from speaking with fellow founders and heard their pain on how they weren't taking enough salary or sometimes any salary at all, and they were having to work part-time in the evening to make ends meet. Some investors seemed to become distracted by salary as a cost to the detriment of the business, whilst in parallel, founders were struggling to raise and consistently missing their growth targets or their product milestones. I learned that founders and teams should be paid enough to focus solely on the mission. The right investors agreed with me, and this also helped me become more comfortable in my own skin. The words of corporate life that used to talk me down have taken on new perspectives and become strengths. Disruptive becomes nonconformist. Argumentative becomes passionate. Challenging becomes innovative. And not fitting in turns into memorable. It showed me that founders should embrace their strengths and their experience, and this enables stronger mental health and increases a startup success. But what does startup success mean to you? Stories abound of now millionaires who've risked everything to build a business in a garage, but we don't hear about the ones that don't work. And sadly, it's most of them that don't work. So why would any sane person take a startup personal loan 2 weeks after being made redundant? Because making it as a startup isn't easy. In fact, even getting going is almost impossible. 80% of businesses don't see their first year anniversary. 9 out of 10 fail within the first 3 years. Only 1% of startups raise investment. Yet these odds don't stack up in the echo chamber of social media, when everything often appears easy to portray success. Here, attempts to create the fear of missing out use the toxic "fake it until you make it" as a mantra which is damaging to every other startup when 72% of founders struggle with mental health issues. It's not fair to judge yourself against the model on the cover of the magazine when the model on the cover of the magazine doesn't even look like the model on the cover of the magazine. Next time you see a success story about raising investment, try and consider the different perspectives that I encountered. High-profile fundraisers completed by someone who's been there and done it before with the same backers. Crowdfunding rounds that celebrate smashing their target in minutes when they already had most of the money in the bank before they even started. Or headline numbers linked to services or future lines of credit. Funds look for founders to invest in while simultaneously listing on sites to raise money for their own capital. We were turned down by one VC who was still trying to raise investment on the same platform long after us. The external perspective that it is easy to raise investment conflicts with the odds that say 96 out of 100 investors you speak with will say no, and that's if you're lucky to get a no. In each of our funding rounds, I made the mistake of continuing to communicate with investors who really were always out. I missed all the red flags and I wasted hours. And this was in the eagerness to remain optimistic. And I lost sight of being realistic. I learnt to start calls by setting expectations of timing and interest from both sides before continuing, and I'd always encourage founders now to do the same. An overnight success takes years, and some of our funding came from relationships that I'd built up over years, alongside new investors that I'd met through an angel investment network. When someone would ask if we had grit, I would think of how I got to know our international investors. The time difference meant that I would sometimes stay up past midnight so that I can communicate in real time. And then I'd set my alarm and I'd get up at 3 and to check emails before rising again at 7. I never wanted to miss something that cost our momentum. We hit our investment target twice in just 6 months. But it was a full-time job with over 400 meetings. And this is the reality for most people who are successful in raising investment. So if fundraising is a full-time job, how do you even go about running a startup? The reality is, you probably can't. Many businesses fail because founders spend so long working on the business rather than in the business. And the simplest way to give yourself the best chance of success is through sharing the load. I can't comprehend what our startup would look like if I was a sole founder. Trivial tasks such as opening a company bank account or applying for trademarks or updating company's house suddenly become a drain on my time when COVID is causing the suspension or delay of services. So building a great team is one of the most important things in getting a startup off the ground. Even with the best idea, the successful implementation is all dependent on the team. When the rest of the world tells you to identify your weaknesses, why not find out what makes you good and turn that into great? And then surround yourself with the support to fill in your gaps. If I can build a business from a central London hot desk and the kids' playroom, then founding a business in lockdown adjusted our thinking, and it gave us the flexibility to build an entire team remotely. It's not been without the challenges of international time differences or language barriers, or the nuances of different notice periods when you're hiring, or the complexities of creating an entirely new subsidiary business with local support. But assembling a culturally diverse group of people also proved that our company's mission was global. There's so much talent outside of the London bubble, and I know that we'll continue to deepen our commitment to our team internationally, and particularly in India. But everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. But lost in the UK bubble of COVID, it's easy to forget that there are so many other challenges elsewhere that have impacted our business, and most importantly, our people's lives. The Black Lives Matter protests erupted around our brand designer in the US. Riots surrounding the Belarus elections led to a week-long country shutdown. Terrible flash flooding in Hyderabad knocked out power for our engineers. And our head of machine learning had an internet blackout caused by the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. But what is chaos for the fly is calm for the spider. These lessons and battle scars, with a tiny team distributed across the world, makes us rightfully very proud to pass the first hurdles that kill most startups. Now, I could share an awful lot more about startup life over the last 12 months. How a school shutdown left me sharing my desk with the Science Lab's 4 giant African snails, or when I took a short notice guest slot on a business live stream and found myself in a Nirvana tribute show having to name my top 3 songs, and how an early morning recording for an awards event left me taking video calls all day wearing a tuxedo. But I'll save those for another day. An investor once asked me if they could be an advisor, and I told them that that was the bare minimum that I expected, because we were in this together. So far, leading a startup has been the most rewarding and exciting time, but also the hardest under any circumstances. I would have never have got through the last 12 months without the loving support of my family or friends, and the relentless hard work of my colleagues. It feels impossible to judge our success, and the odds are ever against us when most founders fall out, tap out, or burn out. Yet still, we push forward. If I leave you with one new perspective, it's this. I have spent the last 5 months leading up to delivering this talk. Preparing just a few minutes has taken hours of doubt, writer's block, second guessing, imposter syndrome, and sleepless nights. This talk, our business, our success, it's just the tip of an iceberg. It's all been the result of the huge effort that happens out of sight. Never underestimate that. Thank you.